She knelt in the dark with her hands buried in cool, damp earth, and the whole town of Prosperity Flats agreed she had lost her mind. The cellar smelled of soil and stone, and a strange, clean scent like fresh snow. Around her, arranged in careful rows, were baskets woven from willow switches she'd cut herself, dozens of them, and from each basket spilled a ghostly treasure. Mushrooms, hundreds of them, white as bone, firm as apples, and pushing up from the loamy earth with a silent, relentless force. They were a fortune. They were a miracle. And outside the thick stone walls of her small, lonely house, the world was turning to dust. The August sun had baked the valley for 60 straight days, and the corn in every other field was nothing but brittle, yellowed paper. Hunger was no longer a threat whispered in the evenings. It was a guest who had kicked in the door and taken a seat at every table. Only here, in the cool dark beneath 12 acres of worthless locust scrub, was there abundance. It was a secret she had kept like a banked coal, a single point of heat and light hidden under a mountain of gray ash. 8 months earlier, in the last cold gasp of a bitter winter, Elspeth had stood before the land agent's desk, a ghost herself. At 22, she was an orphan, pushed out of the family farm by her 2 older brothers the moment the dirt from their father's grave had settled. They had given her what the law required, and not a penny more, their faces hard with the kind of pity that feels more like a shove. A young woman alone, her eldest brother Thomas had said, his voice thick with false concern. "You can't run a place. Go to the city. Find a husband." They wanted the good bottomland, the wide, fertile fields their father had tamed. They did not want her. So she had taken her meager inheritance, a worn leather purse with $40 in it, and walked the 10 miles to town. Silas Croft, the land and grain agent, had leaned back in his leather chair, a portrait of smooth, predatory warmth. He appraised the thin, determined young woman before him, her coat patched at the elbows, her hands already chapped from a life of work. $40, he'd repeated, letting the sum hang in the air like a poor joke. "My dear girl, that won't get you a decent plot for a chicken coop." Elspeth's chin did not tremble. "Is there anything?" Croft had steepled his fingers, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. It was the smile of a man who enjoyed the small, cruel victories of commerce. He shuffled through a stack of deeds, dusty papers representing the hopes and failures of 100 families. He pulled one from the very bottom. "Well, there is one parcel. 12 acres. No one's wanted it for 20 years. It's a mess of locust trees and thorny brush on a northern slope. The soil's thin and sour, they say. Useless for corn, useless for grazing. The deed's been sitting here since old man Hemlock died of misery on it." He slid the paper across the desk. "But it has a cabin, a stone foundation at least, and a well, though I can't vouch for its sweetness. It's yours for $40, clear and final." It was a swindle, and they both knew it. He was selling her a plot of land defined by its uselessness, a place where hope went to die. For him, it was a way to clear a worthless property off his books and feel magnanimous doing it. For Elspeth, it was the only patch of earth in the world she could afford to call her own. "I'll take it," she said, her voice quiet but firm. She counted out the worn bills and the tarnished silver onto his polished desk. The finality of the act was a cold weight in her stomach. Croft had signed the deed with a flourish, his expression one of amused condescension. He was ridding himself of a problem, and she was buying one. Her walk to her new home was a pilgrimage of mockery. She passed neighbors who knew her family. They saw her walking not toward a home, but away from one, carrying a small bundle of her belongings. "Heard your brothers kept the farm," one man called out from his wagon, his tone a mix of gossip and pity. "Where you headed, Elspeth?" "I bought the old hemlock place," she replied, not breaking her stride. The man had actually laughed, a short, sharp bark. "The locust scrub? Child, you'd have done better to sleep in the street. Nothing's ever grown there but thorns and disappointment." That was the town's verdict, delivered before she had even set foot on the property. She was the foolish girl who had traded her birthright for a patch of weeds. As she walked, the words echoed in her mind, a chorus of doubt. By the time she saw the crooked shape of the cabin through the tangled, skeletal branches of the locust grove, a part of her believed them. The land was a dark, forbidding tangle, a place that looked like it had already given up. One person alone, they said. A woman alone. It was not a question. It was a judgment. The cabin was worse than Croft had described. It was 4 tight stone walls with a sagging roof that looked like a sway-backed horse. The wind whistled through chinks in the mortar, carrying the scent of rot and old sorrows. The single room was bare, save for a broken chair and a thick coat of dust. But the foundation was solid, built of heavy field stone dragged from the earth a generation ago. The well, when she finally cleared the debris from its mouth and lowered the bucket, yielded water that was cold, clear, and tasted faintly of stone, not of sulfur or mud. It was a small, quiet victory, the first of many she would have to win against this place. That first night, huddled in her father's old wool blanket on the floor, she did the arithmetic of survival. $40 gone. Her remaining assets, a sack of flour, a side of bacon, a handful of beans, a jar of salt, and her own 2 hands. She had no seed, no livestock, no neighbors close enough to borrow from. The town of Prosperity Flats was a 10-mile walk away, a journey to a place where she was already a cautionary tale. She counted the days her food might last. 30, if she was careful. 40, if she was hungry. After that, nothing. The silence of the locust grove pressed in, vast and indifferent. It was easy, in that moment, to believe the town was right. It was easy to feel the cold fingers of despair. But stubbornness was a thing her father had passed down to her, a quiet, unyielding grit that had been mistaken for meekness her whole life. She would not despair. She would adjust. She would watch. The land was all she had, and she would learn its language. The first week was a battle of attrition. She spent her days not fighting the locust trees, as any sensible farmer would have, but mending the cabin. She mixed clay and dried grass to patch the mortar, her fingers raw and bleeding. She scavenged fallen branches to repair the roof, learning the geometry of stress and support. She swept out the ghosts of the cabin's past and made it her own. At night, she did not dream. She lay on her thin pallet and listened to the sounds of the grove, the whisper of wind through thorny branches, the scuttling of small creatures in the leaf litter, the deep, resonant silence of the earth beneath her. Most people heard nothing. Elspeth taught herself to listen. She met her only neighbor by chance in that first month. Mrs. Zelenka lived a mile down the dirt track, on a small, tidy plot with a garden that was a riot of strange-smelling herbs and gnarled vegetables. She was an old woman from a country no one could place on a map, with eyes the color of a stormy sea and hands as brown and wrinkled as walnuts. She appeared at the edge of Elspeth's property one afternoon, a small basket on her arm, watching the young woman haul a bucket of water from the well. "They say you are the girl who bought the thorns," Mrs. Zelenka said. Her voice was accented, the words shaped differently, as if they had traveled a long way to be spoken. Elspeth straightened, wary. "I am." The old woman's eyes weren't mocking. They were assessing. She looked past Elspeth at the dense, dark stand of locust trees. She sniffed the air. She took a step onto the property and crumbled a bit of the dark, leafy soil between her fingers. It was a gesture of profound intimacy, like reading a secret letter. Most saw a failed patch of ground. Mrs. Zelenka seemed to be seeing a hidden history. "This land is not empty," she said, her gaze still fixed on the grove. "It is waiting for the right eyes to see." She offered no further explanation. She simply nodded, turned, and walked away, leaving Elspeth standing by the well, the cryptic words hanging in the cool spring air. Waiting for what? Seen by whom? The encounter was unsettling but also oddly validating. It was the first time someone had looked at her land without pity. It planted a seed of curiosity that began to crowd out the despair. As spring began to soften the edges of the world, Elspeth turned her attention from the cabin to the land itself. Everyone in the valley knew how to farm. You cleared the land, you broke the soil with a plow, you planted in straight, obedient rows, and you prayed for rain. That was the catechism of the plains. But Elspeth had no plow, no mule, and no desire to level the one thing her land possessed in abundance: the locust trees. The town saw them as a plague, a thorny, fast-growing pest that choked out useful plants. But Elspeth, forced into observation by a lack of resources, began to see them differently. She saw how their dense canopy created a deep, perpetual shade, a world apart from the sun-blasted fields of her neighbors. The air under the trees was always cooler, the ground always damp. She noticed the way the locust leaves, when they fell, decomposed into a rich, black, fragrant loam, unlike the heavy clay soil of the surrounding valley. The thorny branches, a nightmare to walk through, created a natural fence that kept out the deer and other foragers. The grove was not a chaotic mess. It was an ecosystem with its own logic, its own quiet economy. She began to walk its boundaries and then its interior, not with an axe, but with a quiet watchfulness. She learned the deer paths, the places where water pooled after a rain, the subtle shifts in the soil from one end of the property to the other. One cool morning in late April, while clearing away a patch of choking briars from the base of an ancient gnarled locust, her fingers brushed against something in the leaf litter. It was cool, smooth, and yielded slightly to pressure. She gently scraped away the black earth. There, nestled against the decaying wood of a fallen log, was a small, perfectly round, impossibly white object. It looked like a quail's egg carved from marble. It was a mushroom, but like none she had ever seen. The wild mushrooms of the valley were brown or tan, earthy and obvious. This was different. It was pristine, almost luminous in the filtered light of the grove. She dug around it carefully and found a small cluster of them, pushing up from the soil with a silent, patient strength. A memory stirred Mrs. Zelenka's words. "This land is not empty. It is waiting." She harvested one, its stem breaking with a faint, clean snap. It felt heavy in her palm, dense and substantial. She carried it back to the cabin and set it on the rough-hewn table. It seemed to glow in the dim light. It was a question. Driven by an instinct she didn't understand, she wrapped the others in a damp cloth, placed them in her basket, and took the 10-mile walk back toward Mrs. Zelenka's cottage. She felt foolish, like a child carrying a pretty rock to a geologist. But the memory of the old woman's knowing eyes compelled her. Mrs. Zelenka was in her garden, her back bent over a row of peculiar purple-leafed cabbages. She straightened as Elspeth approached, her gaze falling immediately to the basket. "You have been listening to the ground," the old woman stated. It was not a question. Elspeth unwrapped the cloth. The white mushrooms sat nestled within, looking like a clutch of unhatched eggs. Mrs. Zelenka drew a sharp, astonished breath. She reached out a trembling, wrinkled finger and touched one, her face a mask of disbelief and reverence. "Kamena huba," she whispered, the foreign word soft as a prayer. "In my country, it means stone cap. They say it grows only where the ground remembers a lightning strike. They say a king would trade a bag of gold for a basket of them." She looked from the mushrooms to Elspeth, her eyes wide. "They cannot be farmed. They choose their own soil. They are a gift from the earth, not a crop from a man." She picked one up, holding it to her nose. "This smell, clean, like winter. They are poison to no one, and a feast to everyone." Then she looked past Elspeth, toward the distant dark line of the locust grove. A slow smile spread across her face, a map of wrinkles rearranging themselves into an expression of pure delight. "Of course," she murmured, "the locust wood, the sour soil, the deep shade. It is the only place they would consent to grow." She fixed Elspeth with a look of profound respect. "Everyone sees thorns. You saw the house the treasure lives in." The old woman then delivered the lesson that would change everything. She told Elspeth that the stone caps were a secret the land kept. To harvest them was not to take, but to encourage. She taught her how to clear away the competing weeds without disturbing the delicate web of mycelium in the soil, how to manage the leaf litter to maintain the perfect level of moisture and decay, how to use the thorny branches to protect the mushroom beds from the wind and sun. It was a form of gardening that was the opposite of farming, a process of listening and responding, not of commanding and controlling. "The best fruit grows on the ugliest tree," Mrs. Zelenka said, handing the basket back to Elspeth. The aphorism settled into Elspeth's mind, a perfect, polished stone of truth. You must be patient, and you must be quiet. A treasure like this makes greedy men into monsters. Elspeth walked home in a daze, the 10 miles feeling like 10 steps. The world had been remade. Her worthless land was a hidden jewel box. Her poverty was a disguise. The mockery of the town was the sound of men who were blind to the truth beneath their feet. She began the work in earnest, her movements now filled with purpose. She rose before the sun, her hands no longer just fighting for survival, but tending a secret garden. She moved through the grove like a ghost, her work invisible to any passerby. She was no longer a foolish girl digging in the dirt. She was a custodian of a miracle. The work was methodical, a quiet rhythm that became the center of her world. Day after day, she moved through the locust grove, her hands protected by crude leather gloves she'd stitched herself. She wasn't clearing the land, she was curating it. With a small hand scythe, she trimmed back the nettles and briars that crowded the floor of the grove, creating clean, open patches of dark, loamy earth around the bases of the oldest trees. She learned to read the ground, to see the faint web-like patterns of the mycelium just beneath the surface. These were the veins of her secret mine, the living network from which the stone caps would spring. She gathered the thorny locust branches she cleared and wove them into low protective fences around the most promising areas, creating little sanctuaries of shade and stillness. It was back-breaking labor, but it felt like prayer. Each cleared patch was a question asked of the soil, and slowly, the soil began to answer. The first true harvest was a handful, 10 perfect, dense, white orbs that she carried back to the cabin as if they were diamonds. She set them on the table and just looked at them, a feeling of fierce, private joy swelling in her chest. It had worked. The arithmetic in her head began to shift. It was no longer just about the 40 days her food would last. It was about the potential value of a single, perfect mushroom. She kept her success hidden, like a sin. When she had to walk to town for supplies, she endured the pitying looks and condescending questions with a new, quiet stillness. "Still trying to make a go of it on that old scrub heap?" a farmer asked as she bought a small bag of flour. She just nodded, her face betraying nothing. Let them think she was failing. It is easier for people to believe a thing is rotten than to admit they were wrong to mock it. Her secret was a small, warm coal she banked low under the ash of their assumptions. As May warmed the valley, the mushrooms came faster. A handful became a basketful. A basketful became two. She converted the dark, musty root cellar beneath her cabin into a nursery. She hauled buckets of the rich black locust loam down the stone steps and laid it out in shallow wooden crates she'd built. She carefully transplanted sections of the mycelium-rich soil, an experiment to see if she could coax the stone caps to grow in the controlled darkness. For a week, nothing happened. She checked them every morning, her hope waning. Then one day she saw it, a tiny white pinhead pushing through the black earth in one of the crates, then another and another. Soon, the entire surface was dotted with them. The cellar, with its constant cool temperature and profound darkness, was the perfect echo of the grove floor. She had not farmed them. Not really. She had simply invited them into her home, and they had accepted. It was during this time that she met Finn. He was a boy of about 10, with hair the color of straw and a perpetually curious expression. He was the son of a grim-faced farmer on the other side of the valley, a boy who seemed to prefer wandering the woods to doing chores. He stumbled upon her one afternoon, not in the grove, but as she was emerging from the angled cellar door, a basket of pristine white mushrooms in her arms. He didn't laugh or point. He just stared, his eyes wide with wonder. "What are those?" he breathed, his voice hushed. Elspeth froze, her heart hammering. Her secret was out. But looking at the boy's guileless, fascinated face, she saw no threat. She saw only the same awe she had felt herself. "They're called stone caps," she said quietly. "They grow here." "I ain't never seen nothing like 'em," he said, stepping closer. "They look like moons." From that day on, Finn became her silent accomplice. He would appear at the edge of the grove in the afternoons, and without a word, he would help. He'd pull weeds, haul water, or just sit and watch her work, asking quiet, intelligent questions. He never told a soul. It was their shared secret, a silent pact of purpose. He gave her something she hadn't realized she was missing: companionship. The presence of the boy, his unquestioning belief in her work, was a balm against the loneliness and the steady, grinding doubt of the town. He began naming the mushrooms in the cellar, giving the biggest ones names like King and Cloud and General. It was a child's game, but it brought a gentle, welcome humor to the hard labor, humanizing the strange, silent crop they were tending together in the dark. By June, the sky had turned a hard, unforgiving blue. The spring rains had been miserly, and now, day after day, the sun beat down on Prosperity Flats. The creeks, usually full and talkative, shrank to sluggish, muddy trickles. The farmers in the valley started to look at the sky with a familiar, anxious squint. Their corn, which had sprouted green and hopeful, began to show the first signs of stress, the leaves curling inward as if in pain. The town's talk, once filled with gossip about Elspeth's foolishness, now turned to the price of hay and the depth of the water in their wells. Elspeth, however, walked into her locust grove and found an oasis. The dense canopy of the trees, once seen as a curse that blocked the sun, was now a blessing. It was a vast green parasol that preserved the cool and the damp. While the surrounding fields baked and cracked, the soil in her grove remained dark, moist, and alive. The drought, a creeping disaster for everyone else, was a boon for her. The stone caps, thriving in the sheltered, stable environment, grew with an almost alarming vigor. The cellar was no longer just a nursery. It was a factory. Basket after basket of the firm, white globes came up from the dark. The sheer volume was becoming a problem. They were perishable. She couldn't eat them all, and she couldn't risk selling them in Prosperity Flats, where their appearance would raise too many questions. Following Mrs. Zelenka's advice, she had begun drying them. She sliced the mushrooms into thick, coin-like discs and laid them on racks in the hot, dry air of her cabin's small attic. They shrank and hardened into what looked like chips of ivory, their strange, clean scent concentrating into something earthy and intensely fragrant. The arithmetic in her head had evolved again. It was no longer about survival or simple profit. It was about wealth. She counted the dried mushrooms, weighing them in her hands. She had gallons of them, pounds of them. A treasure, Mrs. Zelenka had called it. But a thing is only worth what someone is willing to pay for it. The people of Prosperity Flats would pay for corn and beans, not for a strange white mushroom they'd never seen. Her treasure was worthless without a market. So, one clear, hot morning, she packed a small cloth sack with a pound of the dried stone caps, put on her best, and only, clean dress, and began the long walk not to town, but past it, toward the stagecoach stop on the main road. She was going to the city. It was a gamble, spending her carefully hoarded money on a coach ticket. But she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she couldn't stay hidden forever. It was time to find out what her secret was truly worth. The city was a cacophony of noise and smells, a world away from the quiet grove. The stagecoach dropped her on a street teeming with more people than she had ever seen in one place. Horses, wagons, and finely dressed men and women rushed past, a river of purpose and commerce. For a moment she was overwhelmed, a small, plain figure in a homespun dress, clutching a cloth sack. The mockery of her hometown echoed in her ears. What was she doing here? Who would listen to a girl from the Locust scrub? But the weight of the dried mushrooms in her sack was a solid, reassuring presence. She squared her shoulders and asked for directions to the grandest hotel in the city, the Imperial. Mrs. Zelenka had told her tales of the chefs in such places, men who paid fortunes for rare flavors from distant lands. It was a long shot, a fool's hope, but it was the only one she had. The Imperial Hotel was a palace of brick and polished brass. A doorman in a severe uniform looked her up and down, his expression a wall of disapproval. "Deliveries are in the back," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. Elspeth's face burned, but she held her ground. "I'm not making a delivery," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I have something for the chef, something he will want to see." The doorman's skepticism was a physical force, but there was a quiet authority in her stance that made him hesitate. After a long, tense moment, he grumbled and led her not through the opulent lobby, but down a side hall and into the hot, clamoring chaos of the hotel kitchen. The air was thick with the smells of roasting meat, boiling stock, and 100 other things she couldn't name. Men in white coats shouted and rushed, pans clattered, and fire roared from a massive stove. At the center of it all was a tall, imposing man with a fierce mustache and a stained apron. This was Monsieur Dubois, the chef, a legend in the city for his discerning palate and explosive temper. "What is this?" he boomed, turning from a pot to glare at her. "Who let a farm girl in my kitchen?" Elspeth's heart pounded against her ribs. This was it. The moment of proof or failure. She walked forward and placed her cloth sack on a clear space on his massive butcher block table. "I was told you appreciate rare ingredients, sir," she said. He snorted, a sound of pure contempt. "Rare ingredients do not arrive in a dusty sack carried by a child. Go home." He turned his back on her. "They are called stone caps," Elspeth said, her voice rising just enough to cut through the din. "They grow in only one place, and they taste like nothing else." Something in her tone, a note of absolute conviction, made him pause. With an exasperated sigh, he turned back and untied the sack, spilling the contents onto the table. A pile of hard, white, ivory-like discs. He picked one up, sniffed it, and scoffed. "Dried fungus. I have barrels of dried fungus from France, from Italy. What makes you think your peasant mushrooms are special?" But he did not throw them away. He broke a small piece off and, to her surprise, popped it into his mouth, chewing with a critical, thoughtful expression. A long silence fell over their small section of the kitchen. The chef's eyes, which had been hard with irritation, slowly widened. He stopped chewing. He looked at the mushroom chip in his hand as if seeing it for the first time. Then he looked at Elspeth. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a sharp, intense curiosity. "Incredible," he whispered. He barked an order to a nearby cook, who scurried over with a small pan of simmering broth. The chef dropped a few of the dried discs into the hot liquid. In seconds, they softened and swelled, returning to their plump white state, releasing a clean, fragrant steam that cut through the heavier kitchen smells. He fished one out with a spoon, blew on it, and tasted it. This time, his eyes closed. A look of pure, unadulterated bliss settled on his face. "Mon Dieu," he breathed. He opened his eyes and stared at her as if she were a magician. "Where did you get these?" "They grow on my land," she said simply. "How many can you get?" "More than this," she said, a masterpiece of understatement. The chef's professional demeanor snapped back into place, but now it was charged with a different energy. It was the excitement of a prospector who had just struck gold. "I will buy them," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I will buy every single one you can bring me, dried or fresh. Name your price." Elspeth had rehearsed this moment in her mind, had done the desperate arithmetic 100 times, but now, faced with the reality of it, she felt a dizzying sense of power. She named a price, one that felt impossibly high, a number that made her own throat tighten. The chef did not even blink. "Done," he said. "A standing order. Deliver them weekly. You will be paid in cash." He scribbled a contract on a piece of kitchen letterhead, his handwriting a frantic scrawl. He signed it and handed it to her, along with a thick wad of bills as an advance. Elspeth walked out of that kitchen and into the bright city street, the contract in her pocket and the cash clutched in her hand. The world felt brand new. The doorman who had sneered at her now held the door open, his face a mask of confusion. She was no longer the foolish girl from the Locust scrub. She was a businesswoman. She was a success. And no one in Prosperity Flats had any idea. August arrived like the open door of a furnace. The sun rose each morning not as a golden promise, but as a white-hot eye in a bleached sky. The drought tightened its grip on the valley, cracking the earth into a mosaic of despair. The corn in the fields was a total loss, brittle stalks rattling in the hot wind. The bean vines were withered and brown. The town's collective mood soured from anxiety to a grim, quiet fear. The laughter in front of the general store was gone, replaced by hushed, worried conversations. Pride, a staple crop in prosperity flats, was beginning to fail. Men who had boasted of their rich bottomland now stood staring at fields of dust, their hands hanging uselessly at their sides. The mockery that had been aimed at Elspeth for months had curdled. No one laughed about the girl on the scrub heap anymore. Now, they whispered. They saw her walking to the stagecoach stop once a week, a heavy satchel in her hand, and saw her return in the evening, her step light. They saw that she did not look hungry, she did not look worried, and in the zero-sum arithmetic of a drought, her prosperity felt like a personal affront. Suspicion, the bitter weed that grows in the soil of envy, began to sprout. Silas Croft, the land agent, heard the whispers. He was a man whose business was knowing things, and he made it his mission to find out what was happening on the 12 acres of worthless land he had so smugly sold. His initial amusement at Elspeth's folly had long since faded. Now, he was intrigued. He rode his fine horse out to her property one afternoon, his face arranged in an expression of neighborly concern. He found her mending a section of her fence, her face shaded by a wide-brimmed hat. "Elspeth, my dear girl," he began, his voice smooth as oil. "I was just passing by. The whole valley is suffering in this terrible heat. I wanted to see how you were faring." Elspeth met his gaze, her own expression calm and unreadable. "I am well, thank you, Mr. Croft." His eyes swept over the property, trying to find the source of the rumors. All he saw was the same dense, useless-looking grove of locust trees. He couldn't see the secret world beneath them. "It's a difficult time," he pressed. "A young woman, all alone out here. If you're finding it too much to manage, perhaps we could discuss me buying the land back. For your own good, of course. I could even offer you a small profit on your original investment. $50, say. Enough to get you to the city and start fresh." It was a probe, a lowball offer designed to gauge her desperation. Elspeth simply drove a fence post into the ground with a solid thud. "The land is not for sale, Mr. Croft." Her calm refusal was not what he expected. A desperate woman would have at least considered it. This stillness, this confidence. It was an anomaly. It was a puzzle, and Silas Croft hated puzzles he didn't have the answer to. He tipped his hat, the smile never leaving his face, but his eyes were cold and calculating. "As you wish. But the offer stands. Should you change your mind?" He rode away, but Elspeth knew this was not the end of it. She had seen the greed behind the mask of his concern. He smelled money, and like a carrion crow, he would circle until he found the source. He began asking questions in town, speaking to the stagecoach driver, piecing together the story of her weekly trips to the Imperial. The driver, for a price, described the hotel, the chef, and the heavy satchels. Croft put it all together. The worthless land was producing something of immense value, and he, Silas Croft, had sold it for a pittance. The thought was a burr under his saddle, an intolerable insult to his professional pride and his avarice. The game had changed. He no longer wanted to simply buy the land back. He wanted to take it. The crisis came to a head in the 3rd week of August. The heat had not broken. The valley was a tinderbox, and the people were becoming desperate. One evening, as the sun set in a hazy red smear, Elspeth heard a knock on her door. It was not a confident rap, but a hesitant, almost shameful tapping. She opened the door to find Jed Miller, a farmer whose land bordered the main road. He was a proud, loud man who had been one of the first to laugh at her purchase. Now his pride was gone. His face was a mask of exhaustion and defeat. He held his hat in his hands, twisting the brim. "Elspeth," he began, his voice rough. He couldn't meet her eyes. "My wife, the children, we're out of flour. The store's credit is cut off. Is there anything you can spare? I'll pay you back when the rains come." His humiliation was a palpable thing in the twilight. Behind him, down the path, she could see his wife and two small children, watching from a distance, their figures thin and hopeful. This was the moment the whole story had been leading to. This was the moral choice. She had a cellar full of food, a treasure that the city would pay a fortune for. She could have turned him away. She could have gouged him, demanding a price that would strip him of his last shred of dignity. The town had scorned her, and now it was at her mercy. She looked past him to his family, and then she looked at his face, stripped bare of its bluster, revealing the terrified father beneath. She thought of Mrs. Zelenka's words, of the secret the earth had given her. It was a gift, not a weapon. "I don't have any flour to spare, Jed," she said, and for a second his face fell. "But I have food." She led him not into her cabin, but to the cellar door. She lit a lantern and led him down the stone steps. The cool air was a shock after the heat outside. The lantern light fell on the rows and rows of baskets, all of them overflowing with the pristine white stone caps. Jed stopped dead on the bottom step, his mouth falling open. He stared, speechless, at the impossible abundance. "What? In God's name?" he whispered. "They're called stone caps," Elspeth said. "They're good to eat." She filled a large basket for him, a heaping measure that must have weighed 20 pounds. "This will feed your family for a week." She handed it to him. He stared at the basket, then at her, his eyes filled with a dawning, shame-faced understanding. He reached into his pocket. "What do I owe you?" This was the second part of the choice. She named a price. It was a fair price, one she knew he could just afford. It was a tiny fraction of what the chef in the city paid her. It was a price of community, not of profit. Jed paid her, his hand trembling slightly. "Thank you," he whispered, the words carrying the weight of his broken pride and his immense gratitude. "Elspeth, thank you." He turned and walked up the steps, a man with his family's next meal secure in his hands. News, in a hungry town, travels faster than fire. By morning there was a line at her door. Not a mob, but a quiet, orderly procession of her neighbors. The same people who had mocked her now stood with their hats in their hands, their faces etched with worry and hope. The story of her generosity to Jed Miller had preceded them. One by one, she sold them her mushrooms at the same fair price. Basket after basket, they came up from the cool, dark earth, a river of white sustenance flowing out into the parched valley. She was feeding the town that had scorned her, and as she worked, another figure rode up the path, his face a thundercloud of fury. It was Silas Croft. He was holding a piece of paper. "This is a notice of tax delinquency," he announced, his voice loud enough for the entire line to hear. "The county has assessed this property's value based on its newly discovered productivity. The tax is $500, due immediately. If you cannot pay, the land is forfeit." It was a lie, a legal fiction he had concocted, a desperate, greedy gambit to seize the land. He smiled, a cold, triumphant curve of his lips. He had her trapped. One person alone could never produce that kind of money. It was not. The line of townspeople went silent. They looked from Croft's smug face to Elspeth's. They were witnesses to a public execution. Croft was using the full weight of the law, or his twisted version of it, to crush the very person who was keeping them from starvation. A low murmur went through the crowd, a sound of anger and injustice. Elspeth looked at the paper, then at Croft's triumphant face. She felt no fear, only a cold, clear anger. She turned to the man at the front of the line. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice clear and strong. "The price for the town just went up." A gasp went through the crowd. Had they been wrong? Was she as greedy as he was? "The new price," she continued, looking directly at Silas Croft, "is whatever you can spare. Pay what you can. If you have nothing, take what you need." A stunned silence fell. Then, one by one, the people in line came forward. They paid with what they had, small coins, worn bills, promises of future labor. Those with nothing received their basket with a nod from Elspeth. It was an act of such profound and unexpected grace that it fundamentally changed the air. The transaction was no longer about commerce, it was about community. While this was happening, a dusty carriage pulled up the road. The door opened, and out stepped Monsieur Dubois, the chef from the Imperial, his face grim with worry. "My dear girl," he said, rushing forward, "the stagecoach driver said there was trouble. I have come for my order, and to pay you." He opened a heavy leather satchel and upended it on the small table she was using. A river of cash, hundreds and hundreds of dollars poured out. It was her payment for the last month of deliveries. The townspeople stared, their eyes wide. They had known she was doing well, but they had no idea of the scale. This was more money than most of them saw in 5 years. Silas Croft's face went pale. His plan, his entire legal artifice, was built on the assumption of her poverty. Elspeth, without a word, began to count. She calmly counted out $500 from the pile of cash. She walked over to Silas Croft, who stood frozen, his smugness shattered. "Here is your tax," she said, her voice ringing with quiet authority. She pressed the money into his slack hand. "And here," she added, her voice dropping, "is the proof of your greed for all our neighbors to see." Shame is a more powerful force than any law. To be exposed as a liar and a cheat in front of the entire community you depend on is a kind of death. Silas Croft stood there, the money in his hand, the eyes of every person in the valley on him. He had been outwitted, exposed, and defeated not by anger or by force, but by quiet competence and radical generosity. He crumpled the cash in his fist, his face a mask of pure hatred, turned without a word, and fled. No one said a thing as he rode away. His power in the valley was broken. The townspeople looked at Elspeth, at the baskets of food, at the pile of money, and they finally saw her. Not the foolish girl, not the outcast, but their savior. The quiet, stubborn woman who had seen a treasure where they saw only thorns, and who, in her moment of triumph, had chosen kindness over vengeance. That evening, as if on cue, the sky broke. The first fat drops of rain fell onto the dusty earth, the scent of it rising like a prayer. The drought was over. The valley would heal, and so would the community. In the weeks that followed, the town's relationship with Elspeth was remade. They came not just to buy, but to help. They offered to repair her roof, to chop wood for the winter, their labor a form of apology and gratitude. She was no longer Elspeth, the girl who lived alone. She was Elspeth of the Grove. She was one of them. One cool autumn afternoon, she and Finn were in the grove after a soft rain. The ground was dotted with thousands of new stone caps, tiny white pins pushing up through the dark, damp earth, a promise of future abundance. Finn was carefully clearing leaves from a new patch. Elspeth watched him, a sense of deep, settled peace filling her. She was home. She was secure. She was not alone. She knelt and picked one of the new mushrooms, its surface cool and smooth as a river stone. She remembered Mrs. Zelenka's wrinkled, knowing face. "The best fruit," she said softly, to Finn and to the listening quiet of the grove, "grows on the ugliest tree." And for the first time, she understood the full truth of it. The value was not just in the treasure you found, but in the strength you discovered in yourself while everyone else was busy laughing.